Hey, welcome to the Southern Catholic. My name is Jesse Jones, and thanks for joining me. Just a recap of the last episode. I taught about epistemology, which is a branch of philosophy, and it deals with knowledge. What is knowledge, and how do we know what we know? Now, I concluded the episode by stating that Protestantism suffers from an epistemological issue, in that when you have two different views of one single passage, and they're competing views, how do you know who is right and who is wrong? And in Protestantism, there is no way to know this. 500 years after the Protestant Reformation, there still isn't one single Protestant church. And that's because of the Protestant motto that everyone should be able to interpret the Bible subjectively, meaning, using their own subjective understanding to understand the text. The argument was made by Luther that if everyone had Scripture in his or her own language, that he or she could interpret the Scriptures in an orthodox way. Orthodox means true or right. Okay, so whenever someone talks about the Orthodox faith, they're talking about the true faith. And I stated that has proven to be false. That individuals, there has to be some other authority other than the individual, because you have competing views about what Scripture says and how you determine who's right and who's wrong. And I stated in the last video that authority is the church, and that church was established by Jesus Christ. And so in this episode, I want to take a look at that church, talk about some of the characteristics of it, and I really apologize because I was hoping to have a software that would allow me to share the text while discussing the text, but I haven't yet gotten that. And I really want to get a video out this week because I'm trying to put a video out each week. But hopefully next week I'll be able to share the text and we'll be able to look at it together. But for now, if you will, go to the book of Matthew and turn to chapter 16, verse 18. And I'm reading from the Revised Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version. It was an ecumenically translated Bible, so I feel like it should be sufficient for our purposes. So here Jesus is talking to the apostles and he's asking them, who do you think that I am? And they give him various answers, and Peter is the only one who gives an orthodox answer. He says, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus says, "Blessed art thou, Simon Barjona, because it is not flesh and blood that has revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." So what Peter is stating is not a philosophy, it's revelation. That's where all theology is supposed to come from. And the principles that we can draw from revelation. But that's for another episode. For now, Peter was given this revelation, and Christ goes on to say, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." That passage is loaded because there's so much going on there. Peter's name was changed to Peter from Simon by Christ. When God changes your name, it's significant. It usually indicates what your vocation is, what you're called to do. Such is the case with Abram. His name was changed from Abram to Abraham. Abram means reverent father, I think, and Abraham means father of a multitude. So that name change meant something. Peter's name change means something too. In the Koine Greek, this passage reads, in the Koine Greek, the word used for Peter is Petros, and the word used for rock is Petra. Some will argue that this word usage is used by the author to indicate that Peter is not the rock that the church is built on, that it's on the Petra and not Petros or Petros. However, this is not a valid conclusion, not a sound conclusion anyway, because Petra is feminine. Petros is masculine. And if you know anything about inflected languages, or I know that Greek and Latin, they're inflected languages, and they use gender for the words. That's different than English, which is an analytical language. But the author wouldn't want to give a man a feminine name. So Petros is the masculinization of Petra. Furthermore, if the author was trying to convey that somehow there's a difference in size, because the people who make this argument will say that Petra is the big rock and Petros is the little rock. But that distinction really doesn't stand. If the author wanted to say that Peter was a small rock, he would have used lithos for a smaller rock. But that isn't used in the passage. We also have to remember that Christ and his apostles spoke with each other in Aramaic. And the Aramaic word for rock is Cephas. Kind of like Bocephus, but Cephas. So some of y'all know what I'm talking about, some of you don't. But Peter, when we read this as it should be read, is, and I tell you, you are rock, and on this rock I will build my church. I think there is a pun there, and there are multiple things going on theologically there. We've got the church being built on Peter the person. Also, too, Peter is a stand-in, remember, for the Orthodox confessing Christian. So in a way, everyone is a Peter. And we also have the faith being built on the Orthodox confession. So you got three different things, I think, happening in that phrase. Some people try to make it an either or. Like in Protestantism, they try to say that it can't be built on Peter, it's built on the Orthodox confession. I think sometimes the Eastern Orthodox may try to make that argument too. But it seems pretty obvious to me what's being taught about here in this passage when you consider that they're speaking in Aramaic and there's only one word for both Peter's name and the rock being mentioned. Then he goes on to say, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. So this church is built on Peter, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. People misinterpret this a lot and think that the church is somehow just trying to survive until the second coming of Christ. And that's not what's being said here. You know, it's saying you don't use gates for an offensive measure. Okay, it's not like the church is just huddled up trying to survive, and the gates of Hades are just beating the church down. It's the other way. It's the other way around. It's the reverse. It's actually the church is beating at the gates of Hades with this message of the gospel. If you're talking about an offensive measure at that time, you would be what? You would be using chariots and swords and spears and whatever else. You don't charge anyone with a gate. A gate is meant to keep people out. It's meant to barricade yourself in so that you can survive. So this is a different view than most have of what this passage is saying, because most people think that it's the church just trying to survive in the gates of Hades, but we got the promise that the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. But it's the other way around. It's that the church is proselytizing the whole world, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against that message. Then we have the keys. The keys are fundamental. The keys, Matthew was written for a Jewish audience. Okay, they would have understood what was being said here, because in the Old Testament, there was an official, a court official, who would hold the keys of the kingdom. So he would have the authority of the king, but he wasn't the king. And whatsoever he bound in the name of the king. Whatsoever he loosened in the name of the king. And you can find a reference to this in Isaiah chapter 22, verse 22. I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall shut, and no one shall open. Just a simple reference referring to this key holder position. But as we have the earthly kingdom of Israel. So Christ is establishing his kingdom, which is a spiritual kingdom, but it has certain earthly elements to it. And, this kingdom is made up of those whom Christ has called. That's what where church comes from. It comes from the Greek word ecclesia, meaning an assembly. It's a group of people called to vote on a certain matter. In ancient Greece, they would hold these assemblies to vote on issues. And that's where we get this word church from, the Greek word ecclesia. You can see a reference to the binding and loosening also in Matthew 23 verses 2 to 4, but this is a different group. The Pharisees were thought to have the authority to bind and loosen. As Jimmy Akin points out in his book, The Bible is a Catholic Book, during the time of Josephus is a Jewish historian who points out that the Pharisees were seen to have the authority to bind and loosen fast days and feast days and regulations regarding the law. But in the book of Matthew, chapter 23, verses 2 to 4, the scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on the shoulders of others. So you can see this binding that the Pharisees are thought to have had. But Jesus is giving this binding and loosening authority to his church, his institution. It's a spiritual kingdom, but it has physical elements in that regard, and that it's made up of little rocks. Because if you look in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 19 to 20, Paul is saying, so then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are citizens with the saints and also members of the household of God, built on the foundations of the apostles and prophets, with Jesus Christ himself as the cornerstone. So here Christ is certainly the cornerstone. And then, but that's not a false dichotomy. We don't make a false dichotomy out of that the way Protestants do. A lot of Protestants say Christ is the cornerstone, therefore Peter can't be the rock. That's known as a false dichotomy because it can be both and. It doesn't have to be an either or. And we have a reference to us as being rocks in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 to 5. Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So here, clearly, we are all called to be little Christ. We're called to imitate Christ. We are all stones of that house of the living God. Christ is the cornerstone, and Peter just happens to be the key holder. So he's amongst the stones, but he's the key holder amongst the stones. I should also mention that in chapter 18, verse 18, we see that Christ gives all the apostles the keys. So they're all sharers or shareholders in the keys. But Peter is given this individual role because he's the leader. So even though Christ's kingdom is a spiritual kingdom, it also has a corporal element. Corporal coming from the Latin corpus. That's where we get the word for corpse. It means it has a real presence in reality. You can objectively see it. You can find it. There is a certain argument within Protestantism that the church is simply the body of true believers scattered throughout the many different denominations. And that's not the description given to us in Scripture. Because in Matthew, it is the body of true believers, don't get me wrong. And it has that spiritual element. But if you look at Matthew chapter 18, verse 17, Jesus is telling them how to deal with individuals whom they have a disagreement with. He says, if you go to the individual by yourself and they won't listen to you, then go to the individual with 2 or 3 witnesses. And if they still won't listen to you, then you take it before the church. Okay, he says, if the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. If it's a pure spiritual body, how are you going to take anything to this church? It has to be a corporal element. It has to be something in reality. It has to be something you can objectively find. And it has to be a body that can judge. Because this is what the church is doing right here. The church is judging a situation or a case. If it's purely spiritual and scattered throughout all over the place, and you have no way of identifying really who's in the church and who's not in the church, then how's anything going to be judged? How are you going to judge matters between believers? And the last point I want to point out today regarding the church is that the church is described in Scripture as being the pillar of truth. If you look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15, Paul's telling Timothy, if I am delayed, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and bulwark of the truth. That is profound. That statement there, because if you know what a pillar is, you know that it holds the structure up. If you remember the story of Samson, they cut his hair off, capture him, gouge his eyes out, and they made a mistake of letting his hair grow back. And they brought him into the arena to make sport of him. And at some point during this event, they put him between two pillars. And I guess it was the two main support pillars of the arena that he was in. And he prays for the strength to avenge himself. And God gives him the strength, and he pushes the pillars apart, and the whole place comes down on the assembly that's gathered there, killing himself and the assembly. Without the support of the pillars, the structure couldn't stand. Here, the church is described as being the pillar, one pillar, holding up the truth. There isn't another pillar. There's just one pillar, which is very ironic, because if you're going to go with the Bible alone, sola scriptura, there's no authority outside of the Bible, then it seems like the Bible would have been mentioned here, or Scripture would have been mentioned here as being one of the pillars, but it's not. The pillar is described as the church that is holding up the truth. And when you remove that pillar, what happens to your truth? What happens to the truth? It's no longer supported. It loses, it collapses, it falls in. So those are the basic characteristics of the church that I wanted to cover today, just to show that in Scripture, the authority that we see given in Scripture is given to the church, which Christ established. And he established it on the person of Peter. He gave Peter the keys. We see that it is a corporal element, or a corporal entity that is able to judge matters, and it's also the pillar holding up the truth. Next time when we gather, I hope that I will have the software downloaded so I can share the text. But anyway, thanks for bearing with me without that. And the next episode, I want to talk about sola scriptura as the verses that are used to support sola scriptura. And I want to show why those verses are not sound. Why those verses don't actually work to make the case for sola scriptura. That's what I want to show in the next episode. Until then, thanks and God bless.